suffer from. As they continued their conversation, a flight attendant approached with refreshments. She was professionally courteous, but Malcolm couldn't help noticing the difference in how she interacted with them compared to the staff on the commercial flight. There was no surprise at their presence, no subtle double takes or assumptions, just the automatic respect accorded to those with power and influence. The contrast wasn't lost on Benjamin either. Once the attendant had moved away, he leaned forward, his expression serious. "Malcolm, there's something else I need to tell you. Something I've been planning for a while, but today's events have made more urgent." Malcolm and Jasmine both looked at him curiously. "The surprise I mentioned in my text earlier wasn't just a gift or a family vacation," Benjamin explained. "I've been working on establishing a foundation focused specifically on addressing racial bias in transportation and public accommodations." Jasmine's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You never mentioned this to me." "I wanted to have all the pieces in place first," Benjamin admitted. "The paperwork, the funding structure, the strategic plan. It was going to be my announcement at the next board meeting. But after what happened today," he turned to Malcolm. "I'd like you to be involved, son. Not just as my child, but as someone with first-hand experience of the problems we're trying to solve." Malcolm sat up straighter, intrigued by the proposition. "Involved? That would be up to you," Benjamin replied. "You could share your story if you're comfortable doing so. Help develop educational materials for schools. Work with the team during your summer breaks. I don't want to add to your burdens, but I also don't want to exclude you from work that directly affects your life." The offer hung in the air between them, representing both an opportunity and a responsibility. Malcolm thought about how often he and his friends at Westlake discussed these issues in their dorm rooms late at night, the microaggressions, the double standards, the constant awareness of their blackness in predominantly white spaces. He thought about how theoretical those discussions sometimes felt. Agreeing something should be done, but unsure what that something should be. "I'd like to be involved," he decided. Finally. Not just because of what happened today, but because of all the days before this and all the days that will come after. "If there's something I can do to make things better, I want to do it." The pride in his parents' eyes was evident, but there was something else there too. A flicker of sadness, perhaps that their son had to grow up so quickly in a world that gave him no choice. "There's one more thing," Benjamin added, his tone shifting slightly. "The Foundation's first initiative is going to be specifically focused on airlines. I've already been in discussions with several major carriers about implementing more robust amphibious policies and accountability mechanisms. And I'm guessing Atlantic Airways will now be leading that charge." Jasmine asked with a knowing smile. Benjamin nodded. "Patricia Chin is actually one of the few executives who's been genuinely supportive from the beginning. Today's incident will give her the leverage she needs with the more resistant board members." As they continued discussing the foundation and its potential impact, Malcolm found himself thinking about Dr. Johnson, the retired physics professor who had stood up for him on the plane. He thought about the businessmen who had offered him his card and an internship opportunity. He thought about the flight attendants who had tried, however inadequately, to address Karen's behavior. "You know," he said, interrupting his parents' conversation about foundation governance. "Keep thinking about something Dr. Johnson said to me on the plane. She told me, don't let people like that dim your light." Benjamin and Jasmine both turned to their son, their strategic planning momentarily set aside. "At first, I thought she just meant I shouldn't let racism affect my self-esteem or my ambitions," Malcolm continued. "But now, I'm wondering if it means something else too. Maybe using my voice, our voices to create change is another way of not letting that light be dimmed." Jasmine smiled, reaching out to touch her son's. "That's beautifully put, Malcolm." As the jet soared above the clouds, the Washington family continued their discussion, their approach to the situation evolving from personal reaction to strategic response. The incident with Karen Sullivan had been humiliating and unjust, but it had also crystallized something for all of them. The recognition that their positions of privilege gave them not just protection but also responsibility. What none of them realized was that, while they were having this conversation, videos of the incident were already beginning to circulate online. Passengers from the flight had posted their recordings on social media, and the story of a wealthy white woman calling airport police on a black teenager in first class, only to discover his father owned the airline, was rapidly gaining traction. By the time they landed in Atlanta, the incident would no longer be just a private family matter or even an internal airline issue. It would be a viral sensation thrust into the unforgiving spotlight of public discourse with all the opportunities and complications that entailed. The Washington family's arrival in Atlanta marked the beginning of what should have been Malcolm's relaxing spring break. But the digital wildfire spreading across social media had other plans. As they exited the corporate jet, Benjamin's phone buzzed incessantly with notifications from the airline's PR team, all conveying the same urgent message. The incident had gone viral. Unbelievable, Benjamin muttered, scrolling through the messages. Someone posted a video calling airline Karen gets ultimate comeuppance. It's already got over 2 million views. Jasmine glanced at the phone and frowned. They didn't blur Malcolm's face. Apparently not, Benjamin confirmed grimly. Malcolm, who had been checking his own phone, looked up with a stunned expression. My friends from school are texting me about it. They've all seen it. Paused, reading another message, and now reporters are trying to find out who I am. The family exchanged concerned glances. What had been a personal trauma was rapidly transforming into a public spectacle with Malcolm at the center of it. Let's get home first, Jasmine decided, slipping into crisis management mode. Then we'll figure out how to handle this. During the drive to their Atlanta home, the full scale of the situation became clear. Multiple videos taken from different angles showed Karen's confrontation with Malcolm, the police boarding the plane, and even parts of the discussion in the jet bridge where Benjamin's identity was revealed. Comment sections overflowed with outrage, both at Karen's behavior and at the broader pattern of racial profiling it represented. The videos have been picked up by major news outlets who are running headlines like "Black Teen Racially Profiled in First Plot Twist. His dad owns the airline and karma strikes when Karen picks the wrong target for racial profiling." By the time they reached their home, a sprawling modern residence in an affluent Atlanta neighborhood, several news vans were already parked outside the gates. How did they find our address so quickly? Malcolm asked, sinking lower in his seat as they drove past the reporters. Public records, Jasmine explained tersely. Benjamin's position with the airline isn't exactly a secret. Once safely inside, the family gathered in Benjamin's home office to assess the situation and develop a strategy. The space, with its wall of books and large windows overlooking a meticulously landscaped garden, had been the site of many family discussions, but none quite like this one. We have options, Benjamin began, his business acumen kicking in. We can issue a brief statement asking for privacy. We can do a controlled interview with a journalist we trust, or we can use this as an opportunity to address the broader issues at play. What about Karen? Malcolm asked. Have you seen what people are saying about her online? Figured out who she is, where she works. It's pretty intense. Benjamin nodded solemnly. I've seen it. The internet's capacity for both justice and cruelty never ceases to amaze me. Jasmine, who had been checking her professional email, looked up with a grim expression. It gets worse. Karen Sullivan has been placed on administrative leave by her employer pending an investigation. And according to my contact at the airport, she's received multiple threats. That's not right, Malcolm said quietly. I mean, what she did was wrong. Really wrong. But I don't want her to get hurt or lose her job. His parents exchanged a look of pride tinged with sadness at their sons. Compassion, even for someone who had caused him pain. Unfortunately, once these things go viral, they take on a life of their own, Jasmine explained. The public reaction isn't something we can control. But our response is, Benjamin pointed out, and Malcolm's right, escalating harm isn't the solution here. As they continued their discussion, the house phone rang. Benjamin answered, his expression changing as he listened to the caller. It's Patricia Chin. He informed them, covering the receiver. She says Karen Sullivan is trying to reach us. Apparently, she's desperate to make a public apology now that the videos have gone viral. Malcolm frowned. She sorry about what she did or just sorry she got caught and exposed? That's a very perceptive question, Jasmine noted. And an important distinction. Benjamin spoke briefly with Patricia before hanging up. Karen claims she's had a genuine awakening about her behavior. She wants to make amends publicly and participate in some kind of reconciliation narrative. Convenient timing, Jasmine remarked skeptically. Maybe, Benjamin acknowledged. But if there's even a chance it's genuine, isn't that what we want for people to recognize their biases and work to change them? Malcolm considered this. I guess the question is whether giving her a platform for this awakening helps the cause or just helps her save face. The maturity in Malcolm's analysis again reminded his parents that their son had been forced to develop wisdom beyond his years by navigating a world that judged him by his skin color. We don't have to decide right now, Jasmine said. Let's sleep on it and see how we feel tomorrow. But the digital age waits for no one. By the next morning, the story had evolved further. Karen Sullivan had posted a video apology on her own social media accounts, expressing remorse for her actions and claiming the incident had forced her to confront her own unconscious biases. The apology was being met with mixed reactions, with some praising her accountability while others dismissed it as damage control. Meanwhile, Atlantic Airways had issued a formal statement condemning racial profiling and announcing a comprehensive review of their policies and training procedures. The statement specifically mentioned the Washington family's experience, though it did not identify Malcolm by name out of respect for his privacy. Over breakfast, the family watched these developments unfold on Malcolm's laptop. Well, she's certainly saying all the right things, Benjamin observed as Karen's apology video concluded. Words are easy, Jasmine countered. Change is harder. Malcolm, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. Been thinking a lot about this, about what happened on the plane and what's happening now with all these videos and comments and apologies. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Keep coming back to something Dad said on the jet about how the burden of addressing racism shouldn't fall primarily on those who suffer from it. His parents nodded, encouraging him to continue. So, I'm thinking, what if we offered Karen a different kind of consequence then? Public shame and losing her job? What if we asked her to work with Dad's new foundation to share her experience and what she's learned from it? Benjamin and Jasmine exchanged surprised glances. That's not what I expected you to suggest, Jasmine admitted. I just think, Malcolm continued, that if she's genuinely had this awakening, she claims, then putting her in a position to educate others like her might do more good than watching her get cancelled online. Benjamin considered his son's proposal thoughtfully. It's an interesting idea. Using her experience as a case study in how bias mother and a civil rights attorney had taught her to recognize a genuine emergency, and a flurry of texts from Benjamin set off every alarm bell she possessed. When she read that Malcolm was being detained and questioned by airport police after a white woman had accused him of theft, Jasmine didn't hesitate. She immediately requested a recess from the judge, briefly explained the situation, and left her second chair to handle the proceedings. Some things took precedence over even the most important cases, and her son's safety was at the top of that list. During the drive to the airport, Jasmine had called Benjamin for details, then contacted colleagues who specialized in dealing with law enforcement. As a black woman who had built her career fighting against systemic injustice, she knew all too well how quickly situations involving the police could escalate, especially for young black men like her son. Statistics and case files weren't just professional knowledge for her. They were personal fears that kept her awake at night. The time Jasmine strode into the terminal, her attorney persona was fully engaged. she'd spent years perfecting. This armor, the precise authoritative tone, the impeccable appearance, the ability to enter a room and immediately command respect. It was a necessary shield in courtrooms often dominated by white men, and today it would serve to protect her son. What she hadn't expected was to find Benjamin already there. Her husband had been scheduled to fly into town later that day on business, but he'd clearly rearranged his plans upon hearing about Malcolm's situation. Seeing him standing protectively beside their son, with airline executives hovering nervously behind him, she felt a surge of both relief and grim satisfaction. Now, with Karen Sullivan being escorted away by the airport police and Malcolm safely between them, Jasmine finally allowed herself a moment to process her emotions. The controlled fury she'd been channeling into professional action threatened to break through as she looked at her son's face and saw the residual humiliation in his eyes. "Are you really okay?" she asked Malcolm quietly as they followed the airline manager toward a private lounge. Malcolm nodded, but Jasmine knew her son well enough to see past the brave front. "I'm fine. Just tired." Benjamin squeezed Malcolm's shoulder. "You handled yourself with dignity, son. Far more than most adults would have managed in that situation." "I shouldn't have had to," Malcolm replied, a rare edge in his voice betraying his true feelings. "No," Jasmine agreed firmly. "You shouldn't have." The airline manager, a nervously perspiring man named Greg Harmon, led them into a luxurious private lounge reserved for the airline's most elite customers. "Please make yourselves comfortable," he said, gesturing toward plush leather chairs. "I've ordered refreshments and our executive team is assembling to address this situation personally." "That won't be necessary," Benjamin stated flatly. "What's necessary is ensuring my son gets to Atlanta safely and that this incident is properly addressed." "Of course, Mr. Washington," Harmon nodded vigorously. "Our company jet is being prepared as we speak. And I assure you we take this matter extremely seriously." "As do I," Jasmine interjected, her voice carrying the weight of legal implications. "I'll need copies of all relevant security footage, the complete passenger manifest, statements from the flight crew, and documentation of any previous complaints regarding discriminatory behavior on your flights." Harmon blanched. "Mrs. Washington, I'm not sure if." Attorney Washington Jasmine corrected him smoothly. "And you should be sure, Mr. Harmon, because what happened to my son today wasn't just a customer service issue. It was a clear case of racial profiling that your airline staff allowed to escalate to the point where my minor son was removed from a flight and questioned by police based on nothing but the racist assumptions of another passenger." Before Harmon could respond, the lounge door opened again, and Karen Sullivan was escorted in by Officer Diaz. Her earlier belligerence had given way to a pale, tight-lipped anxiety as she realized the full magnitude of her situation. The officers thought it would be good if Miss Sullivan had an opportunity to address the family directly, Harmon explained uncomfortably. Jasmine exchanged a glance with Benjamin, who gave a slight nod. They had discussed strategies for dealing with racist incidents many times over the years, preparing Malcolm for the unfortunate reality that he would face. Now they were putting their own principles to the test. Karen stepped forward, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her designer purse. "I want to apologize for the misunderstanding," she began, her voice lacking the conviction of genuine remorse. "Misunderstanding," Benjamin repeated, his tone deceptively calm. "There was no misunderstanding. Miss Sullivan, you saw a young black man in first class and decided he didn't belong there. You harassed him, invaded his privacy, and accused him of theft with absolutely no evidence. That's not a misunderstanding. That's racism." Karen flinched at the direct accusation. "I never said anything about race. Isn't about that at all. I was genuinely concerned about would you have been concerned if my son were white?" Jasmine interrupted, fixing Karen with the same penetrating gaze she used to dismantle hostile witnesses on the stand. Karen fell silent, unable or unwilling to answer the question directly. "Your silence is answer enough," Jasmine continued. Let me be clear, Miss Sullivan. You targeted my son because of his race. You violated his civil rights. You subjected him to public humiliation. And there will be consequences for those actions. Are you threatening me? Karen asked, a hint of her earlier indignation returning. No, Jasmine replied coolly. I'm informing you of reality. This incident was witnessed by a plane full of passengers, many of whom recorded it. It's been documented by airport security cameras, and it occurred on an airline where my husband happens to hold significant influence. The consequences I'm referring to aren't threats. They're the natural outcome of your choices today. Officer Diaz cleared his throat. Miss Sullivan, after reviewing the statements and available evidence, we're giving you the option to formally apologize and potentially resolve this without criminal charges for unlawful search of another passenger's belongings. That would be at the discretion of what was suspicious. Jasmine countered. His presence in first class, his possession of electronics, or simply his existence as a young black man in a space you deemed inappropriate for him. The directness of the question left Karen momentarily speechless. Jasmine turned back to the officers. I have the original receipt for the tablet in question. She pulled up an email on her phone and displayed it. Purchased from Apple 6 months ago on my credit card as a gift for my son's academic achievements. I also have documentation of my frequent flyer miles being used to upgrade his ticket to first class. As she spoke, more commotion arose at the end of the jet bridge. A distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit was approaching, flanked by several airline executives who looked simultaneously nervous and deferential. Malcolm's eyes widened. Benjamin Washington strode toward the group, his presence commanding immediate attention. The airline executives trailing him looked like they would rather be anywhere else. What's happening here? Benjamin demanded, his voice controlled but powerful. The airline manager, who had been mostly silent until now, suddenly became very animated. Mr. Washington, I assure you we're handling this unfortunate situation with the utmost care. Karen looked confused by the manager's deferential tone. For you, she demanded of Benjamin. Benjamin ignored her, focusing instead on his son. Malcolm, are you all right? I'm okay, Dad, Malcolm assured him. Though the emotional toll of the incident was evident in his eyes, Benjamin nodded, then turned to the officers. My son was racially profiled, harassed, and falsely accused of theft on one of your flights, he stated, addressing the airline manager rather than the police. His belongings were searched without consent by another passenger who decided he didn't look like he belonged in first class. The airline manager looked mortified. Mr. Washington, I cannot express how deeply sorry we are for this incident. I assure you it does not reflect our company's values or policies. Karen's eyes darted between Benjamin and the manager, clearly trying to understand the dynamic. Excuse me, but who exactly are you? She repeated. Benjamin finally turned to her, his gaze impassive. Benjamin Washington, Malcolm's father. And why is everyone acting like that's supposed to mean something to me? Karen asked defiantly. One of the airline executives behind Benjamin winced visibly. The airline manager cleared his throat uncomfortably. Miss Sullivan, the manager said carefully, Mr. Washington is the majority shareholder of Atlantic Airways and serves as chairman of our board of directors. The color drained from Karen's face as she realized the implications. She was standing in front of the owner of the very airline she was flying on, having just racially profiled and falsely accused his son. I didn't. She stammered. No, you didn't, Benjamin agreed coldly. You didn't consider that a young black man might legitimately be in first class. You didn't consider that he might come from a family that could afford to give him nice things. You saw his skin and made assumptions that say far more about you than they do about him. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the police officers seemed uncomfortable. Officers, Jasmine spoke up, her attorney persona in full force. I'd like to know If Miss Sullivan will be facing any charges for illegally searching my son's belongings and making false accusations against him. Officer Diaz cleared his throat. We're still assessing the situation. Perhaps this will help your assessment, Benjamin added, pulling out his phone. Our son texted us throughout this ordeal. Additionally, I've already received multiple videos from other passengers documenting Miss Sullivan's behavior. I'm sure the airline security cameras in the jet bridge have captured the rest. Karen's defiance crumbled visibly as she realized the extent of the evidence against her. She attempted one last defense. I was just concerned about my safety. Anyone would have been suspicious. No, Miss Sullivan. Dr. Johnson's voice rang out as she appeared in the jet bridge doorway. Not anyone would have been suspicious of a well-behaved teenager reading an engineering textbook. Only someone seeing the world through a lens of prejudice. The gathering of witnesses against her seemed to finally penetrate Karen's denial. She looked from face to face, finding no sympathy in any of them. I want my lawyer, she said finally. An excellent idea, Jasmine replied smoothly. You'll need one. The officers began to escort Karen away to continue their discussion in private. Benjamin placed a protective hand on Malcolm's shoulder. This flight's been delayed long enough. Let's get you on a different plane. The airline manager nodded eagerly. Of course, Mr. Washington. We have a company jet prepared and ready to take you to Atlanta immediately. Malcolm looked up at his father in surprise. Benjamin had never used his position to arrange special treatment for the family before. He believed in working hard and earning your way just as he had done. Dad, you don't have to. Malcolm began. Today I do, Benjamin said firmly. You've been through enough. As they walked away from the gate, leaving the chaos behind, Malcolm felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that the ordeal was over, gratitude for his parents' swift intervention, but also a persistent ache from the humiliation and injustice of it all. What bothered him most wasn't Karen's behavior. People like her had existed throughout history and would continue to exist. What truly hurt was knowing how differently the situation might have played out if he hadn't been Benjamin Washington's son. If his mother hadn't been an attorney, if he hadn't had the resources and connections to defend himself. How many other young black men and women faced similar situations every day without such protection? The thought weighed heavily on him as they made their way through the terminal, the whispers and stares of other passengers following them like shadows. Jasmine Washington had been in the middle of presenting a critical motion in court when her phone vibrated with multiple urgent messages from her husband. Years of experience as both it. Tension in the first-class cabin reached a breaking point. Malcolm sat quietly, his posture rigid with anxiety. He'd faced racism before, but never in such a public, inescapable setting. A quick glance at his phone showed no new messages from his father, which struck him as unusual given Benjamin Washington's typically prompt responses during family emergencies. While Malcolm was checking his phone, Karen seized the opportunity. He's doing something suspicious with his phone, she announced loudly. He could be texting accomplices. The accusation was so absurd that several passengers actually laughed out loud. Dr. Johnson rolled her eyes dramatically. Child, the only suspicious behavior on this flight is coming from you. The flight attendant, James, intervened. Sir, he addressed Malcolm respectfully. We'll be addressing this situation shortly. The gate agent and airport security have been notified. Malcolm nodded, fighting to maintain his composure. He was acutely aware that as a young black man, his reactions would be scrutinized. Any display of the anger or frustration he legitimately felt could be weaponized against him, used to validate Karen's unfounded fears. This was a lesson his parents had taught him repeatedly, one of many unfair burdens he carried by virtue of his skin color. I need to use the restroom, Malcolm said quietly, unbuckling his seatbelt. James nodded sympathetically. Of course, sir. As Malcolm made his way to the first-class lavatory, he felt Karen's eyes boring into his back. closed the bathroom door and leaned against it, finally letting out the breath he'd been holding. In the small, private space, he allowed himself a moment of vulnerability, closing his eyes and counting to 10, as his mother had taught him. "They can't take your dignity unless you give it to them," Jasmine Washington always said. After composing himself, Malcolm splashed cold water on his face and looked at his reflection in the mirror. At 15, he was already tall for his age, with his father's broad shoulders and his mother's expressive eyes. He straightened his Westlake prep hoodie and took another deep breath before opening the door. What he didn't know was that during his brief absence, Karen had taken her harassment to a new level. The moment Malcolm had left his seat, Karen had quickly leaned over and unzipped his backpack, which he'd left securely stowed under the seat in front of him. Her movements were swift and furtive, but not unnoticed. "What do you think you're doing?" Dr. Johnson demanded from across the aisle, half freeceasing from her seat. Karen ignored her, rummaging through Malcolm's belongings until she found what she was looking for, his tablet. She pulled it out triumphantly just as Malcolm returned from the lavatory. "What are you doing with my stuff?" Malcolm asked, his voice cracking slightly with disbelief. Karen held the tablet up like evidence. "In a trial. This is exactly what I was concerned about. An expensive tablet that he clearly couldn't afford legitimately." James rushed over, his professional demeanor finally cracking. "Ma'am, going through another passenger's belongings is completely inappropriate and potentially illegal." But Karen was beyond reason. "This tablet costs nearly $1,000. There's no way this boy could afford this." The naked prejudice in her statement left the cabin in stunned silence. Then from all directions, passengers began to speak up. "Are you serious right now? That's straight-up racism. Someone needs to remove her from the plane. What's your opinion about this situation? Do you think Karen was right to be suspicious, or was she clearly in the wrong?" Comment number 1 if you believe Karen's behavior was completely unacceptable, and like this video if you think Malcolm showed incredible patience in the face of discrimination. Subscribe to hear more stories about justice being served to people who misjudge others based on appearance. Now, what do you think happened when Malcolm's mother found out about this incident? Let's continue with the story. Malcolm stood in the aisle, humiliation and anger coursing through him as Karen continued to hold his tablet like stolen property. "That was a gift from my parents for making the honor roll," he explained, his voice steady despite his emotions. "Please give it back." "Likely story," Karen scoffed. "I'm sure if we check we'll find it's reported stolen." "This is absurd," Dr. Johnson interjected. "You have absolutely no right to touch his belongings, let alone make these wild accusations." The situation had escalated beyond anything Malcolm had prepared for. His parents had given him countless talks about how to handle racist encounters. Be polite. Stay calm. Don't raise your voice. Keep your hands visible. But they'd never covered what to do when someone physically took your possessions and accused you of theft in front of a plane full of people. "I can prove it's mine," Malcolm said, reaching for his phone. "I have the receipt in my email. My parents bought it for me last Christmas." Karen clutched the tablet tighter. "Probably going to delete evidence. Don't let him touch any electronics." James had finally reached his limit. "Ma'am, return the young man's property immediately or I will have to involve the police." "That's exactly what I want," Karen declared. "I'm making a citizen's. This boy has stolen property." A chorus of outraged voices filled the cabin. Even the previously suspicious older couple behind Karen now looked uncomfortable with the direction things had taken. "Citizen's arrest," someone echoed incredulously. "For what?" "Being black in first class." The cabin door reopened and 2 airport police officers entered, followed by the airline's gate manager. They surveyed the chaotic scene. Karen standing with Malcolm's tablet clutched to her chest. Malcolm standing in the aisle with his hands slightly raised in a defensive posture, and dozens of passengers watching in various states of outrage and disbelief. "What's going on here?" the first officer asked. Karen immediately launched into her version of events. This boy has stolen property. Expensive tablet that someone his age couldn't possibly afford legitimately. I'm concerned he might have others stolen items. The officers turned to Malcolm, their expressions unreadable. Is this your tablet, son? Malcolm nodded. Sir, it was a gift from my parents for making the honor roll. She took it from my backpack while I was in the bathroom. He's lying, Karen insisted. Just check if it's reported stolen. The second officer, a middle-aged black man, exchanged a glance with his colleague. Ma'am, did you search this young man's belongings without permission? I was concerned about my safety. Jasmine Washington watches in silent fury as airport police officers surround her 15-year-old son Malcolm in the first class cabin while a smug Karen Sullivan smirks from across the aisle. Nobody realizes Malcolm's father owns the entire airline. Before we dive into this unbelievable story, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Drop your location in the comments. That like button and subscribe if you want to see more stories about justice being served. Now, let's get into how this flight turned into a life-changing moment that nobody on board would ever forget. Malcolm Washington clutched his boarding pass tightly as he made his way down the jet bridge. The 15-year-old's heart raced with excitement. This was his first time flying first class alone. His mother, Jasmine, had used her accumulated airline points to upgrade his ticket as a reward for maintaining straight A's at Westlake Preparatory Academy, the elite boarding school where he'd earned a full scholarship. Remember to text me when you land, Jasmine had reminded him earlier that morning as she dropped him off at the airport. Your Aunt Denise will be waiting at baggage claim. Malcolm had replied with the typical teenage exasperation that masked his appreciation. He understood why his mother couldn't accompany him on this trip back to Atlanta for spring break. She had an important case that couldn't be postponed. As one of the most sought-after attorneys at her firm, Jasmine Washington's schedule was always packed. Malcolm had originally planned to wear his nicest clothes for the flight, a button-down shirt and pressed slacks, but a fellow student had accidentally spilled coffee all over him during breakfast. With no time to change before his shuttle to the airport, he was forced to switch into his casual clothes, a black hoodie bearing his school's logo, jeans, and his favorite pair of sneakers. His mother had taught him appearances mattered, especially for young black men in America. But today he had no choice. As Malcolm located his seat 3A, a window seat in the first row of first class, he carefully stowed his backpack under. Karen declared, he's been acting suspiciously the entire flight. Dr. Johnson stood up, her dignity commanding attention. Officers, I've been observing this entire situation. This woman has been harassing this young man from the moment she boarded. She's made multiple comments implying he doesn't belong in first class, called the flight attendants repeatedly to complain about him, and now she's stolen his property and is falsely accusing him of theft. If anyone should be removed from this flight, it's her. Several other passengers voiced their agreement, some holding up phones that had recorded portions of the incident. The first officer addressed Malcolm. Do you have any way to verify this tablet belongs to you? Yes, sir, Malcolm replied. The email receipt is in my account, and it's unlocked with my fingerprint. He demonstrated by pressing his thumb to the home button, causing the tablet to unlock immediately. My school assignments are on it too. The evidence was clear, but Karen was undeterred. He could have hacked it. These kids know all about technology. The gate manager, who had been quietly assessing the situation, finally spoke. Officers, we've received multiple reports from our flight crew about this passenger's behavior. He nodded toward Karen. They've indicated she's been making potentially discriminatory comments and has now escalated to searching another passenger's belongings without consent. Karen's face flushed with indignation. I'm a paying customer. I spent thousands on this ticket. So did my parents? Malcolm said quietly. My mom used her frequent flyer miles to upgrade me as a reward for my grades. The first officer turned to Karen. Ma'am, I'll need you to return the young man's property and then come with us to discuss the situation further. This is outrageous. Karen protested. I'm trying to report a crime and you're treating me like the criminal. As the confrontation continued, Malcolm's phone buzzed with a call. He glanced down to see his mother's name on the screen. Jasmine Washington never called during her important cases unless it was an emergency. Malcolm realized his father must have contacted her. "Excuse me, sir," he addressed the officer. "It's my mother calling. May I answer it?" The officer nodded and Malcolm stepped slightly away to take the call. "Malcolm, what's happening?" "Your father just called me in a complete state." Jasmine's voice was tense with concern. "Mom." Malcolm's voice finally cracked with emotion. "This lady on the plane accused me of stealing my tablet. She went through my backpack while I was in the bathroom. Now there are police here and—" "Put one of the officers on the phone." Jasmine interrupted, her attorney voice taking over. "Right now, Malcolm." Malcolm returned to the group and extended his phone to the first officer. "My mother would like to speak with you, sir." "'Tis an attorney." The officer took the phone and Malcolm could hear his mother's precise authoritative tone even from a distance. The officer's expression changed as he listened, occasionally saying, "Yes, ma'am, and I understand." After a moment, he handed the phone back to Malcolm and turned to his partner. "We need to get a statement from the young man and clear this up." Karen, still clutching Malcolm's tablet, seemed to realize she was losing control of the situation. "But what about my concerns? What about my safety?" The second officer addressed her firmly. "You need to return the young man's property immediately. Then we'll discuss your concerns at the gate." Reluctantly, Karen handed the tablet to the officer, who returned it to Malcolm. "Thank you, sir," Malcolm said, quietly, carefully placing the tablet back in his backpack. As the officers began to escort Karen off the plane, she made one last desperate attempt. "Check his bag. He probably has other stolen items." The first officer ignored her, but the gate manager addressed the rest of the first-class cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We'll be departing shortly once the situation is resolved." Malcolm sank back into his seat, emotionally exhausted. His phone buzzed again with a text from his father. "Stay on the plane, son. Mother is handling the legal side. I'm handling everything else. Love you." Malcolm wondered what his father meant by everything else. But at that moment, he was just grateful that the nightmare seemed to be ending. What he didn't know was that Benjamin Washington had set in motion events that would make Karen regret her actions far more than she could imagine. Dr. Johnson leaned across the aisle toward Malcolm. "You handled that with remarkable grace, young man. Your parents should be proud." "Thank you," Malcolm replied softly. "They've prepared me for situations, but never quite like this." "It's a shame they had to prepare you at all," Dr. Johnson said sadly. "Some things have changed since I was your age, but clearly not enough." The officers and Karen disappeared into the jet bridge. The remaining passengers in first class collectively exhaled. Several offered Malcolm supportive nods or words of encouragement. The businessman across the aisle even extended his business card. "Engineering, huh? My firm is always looking for bright young talent for our internship program. Give me a call in a few years." Malcolm accepted the card with a grateful smile, though the interaction felt surreal after the intensity of the confrontation. How quickly the world could shift from viewing him with suspicion to offering opportunities. The whiplash was all too familiar. What Malcolm didn't realize was that the most surprising turn of events was yet to come, as his mother's legal expertise and his father's business connections were about to converge in a way that would make this incident far more than just another painful experience of racism to endure. The jet bridge buzzed with tension as the airport police officers escorted Karen Sullivan away from the aircraft. Malcolm remained in his seat, still processing the humiliation and anger from being publicly accused of theft. His phone buzzed continuously with messages from his father, but the details were vague, handling the situation. "Stay calm. Help is coming." Malcolm couldn't imagine what kind of help his father could provide from a distance, but Benjamin Washington had never let him down before. Just as the flight attendants were preparing to close the door for departure, commotion in the jet bridge caught everyone's attention. Karen's voice carried clearly into the cabin. "I demand that you search his bag thoroughly. I know what I saw." Then came an unfamiliar male voice, firm and authoritative. "Ma'am, you've admitted to searching another passenger's belongings without permission. That's a serious violation." "I was concerned for my safety," Karen insisted, her voice rising hysterically. "Why isn't anyone taking my concerns seriously?" The gate agent appeared at the cabin door and spoke quietly to James, the head flight attendant. James's eyes widened and he glanced toward Malcolm before nodding. He approached Malcolm's seat with an apologetic expression, beginning to look strained. "How can I help you, ma'am?" "I need to speak with the captain," Karen demanded, her voice carrying through the first-class cabin. Several passengers looked up from their books and devices. "I'm afraid the captain is busy preparing for our departure, ma'am," James explained. "But as the head flight attendant, I'd be happy to address any concerns." Karen leaned forward, lowering her voice to a stage whisper that was clearly meant to be overheard. "I don't feel safe sitting here. This boy keeps making suspicious movements, and I'm concerned about my personal safety." Malcolm's head snapped up, shock evident on his face. He hadn't moved except to adjust his bag. When asked and to use his tablet, Dr. Johnson made a sound of disgust from across the aisle. James' professional demeanor remained intact, but his eyes flicked briefly to Malcolm, taking in his Westlake prep hoodie and the advanced engineering book beside him. "Ma'am, I've been observing the cabin, and I haven't noticed any concerning behavior from any of our passengers." "Well, you haven't been watching closely enough," Karen insisted. "He keeps reaching into his bag and I don't know what he might have in there. I've read about incidents on planes. I watched the news." The implication was clear and it hung heavily in the air. Malcolm felt his chest tighten as other passengers began to stare. Some looked uncomfortable, others curious, and a few, to Malcolm's dismay, seemed to be considering Karen's words with serious concern. "Ma'am," James began carefully, "we have strict security protocols at the airport. All passengers and their belongings are thoroughly screened before boarding." "That's not enough these days," Karen insisted. "And why is a teenager traveling alone in first class anyway? How did he even afford this ticket? Something doesn't add up." Malcolm had been taught by his parents to stay calm in situations like this, to never give people like Karen the reaction they were looking for. But he could feel his composure slipping. His hands trembled slightly as he closed his tablet. "Excuse me," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I'm just trying to get home for spring break. My mother used her frequent flyer points to upgrade my ticket as a reward for my grades. I'm not bothering anyone." Karen scoffed. "That's exactly what someone with something to hide would say." Intervened, his voice firmer now. "Ma'am, making unfounded accusations against another passenger is not acceptable behavior." "Unfounded?" Karen's voice rose. "Look at him. It doesn't belong here." A heavy silence fell over the first-class cabin. Malcolm felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the plane. The naked prejudice in Karen's statement left no room for interpretation. Dr. Johnson unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, her dignified presence commanding attention. "Young man," she addressed James, "I believe this bit advanced for someone your age?" she asked. Malcolm looked up, meeting her gaze directly for the first time. "Not really. I'm planning to study aerospace engineering in college like my father." "How ambitious," Karen replied, her tone suggesting she found it unlikely. "I suppose they have all kinds of special programs these days." The comment stung, but Malcolm had heard worse. "It's not a special program. Just engineering," he said simply. Before Karen could respond, Samantha returned with a pillow. Karen accepted it with a thin smile that vanished as soon as the flight attendant moved away. Arranged the pillow with excessive movements that repeatedly invaded Malcolm's personal space. "Sorry," she said insincerely when her elbow bumped his arm for the third time. "It's just so cramped here." Malcolm shifted closer to the window. giving her more room, even though the first-class seats were plenty spacious. Karen pulled out her phone and began a loud conversation, seemingly unconcerned that the plane was preparing for takeoff. Yes, Martha, I'm on my way to the charity gala. Oh, you know how passionate I am about helping underprivileged children. Yes, these inner-city kids just need proper guidance. Malcolm inserted his wireless headphones, a birthday gift from his parents, hoping to drown out Karen's performative conversation that was clearly meant for his benefit. The expensive headphones caught Karen's attention immediately. When a different flight attendant, James, according to his name tag, came by to remind Karen to end her call for takeoff, she complied, but then immediately pointed to Malcolm's headphones. Shouldn't he have to turn those off too? She demanded. They're in airplane mode, Malcolm explained, showing the disconnected Bluetooth symbol on his phone screen. James nodded. That's fine, sir. Thank you for being responsible. Karen's lips pursed at the flight attendant's respectful address toward Malcolm. As James moved on, she leaned slightly toward the teenager. Those look quite expensive, she remarked, eyeing his headphones. I bought my son a pair just like those last Christmas. $300. I hope you're taking good care of them. The implication was clear. How could you afford these? Malcolm removed one headphone to reply politely, they were a gift from my parents. I saved up for months to buy them the noise-canceling feature for their anniversary, and they surprised me with these instead. Karen raised her eyebrows skeptically, but said nothing more as the plane began to taxi. Malcolm replaced his headphone and closed his eyes, trying to focus on the music rather than the woman beside him, who seemed determined to make him feel unwelcome. Once they reached cruising altitude, Malcolm pulled out his tablet to review some homework. Karen's eyes narrowed at the sight of the high-end device. My, she said. You certainly have all the latest gadgets, don't you? Malcolm didn't respond immediately, hoping his lack of engagement would discourage further conversation. It didn't. Where did you get that tablet? Karen pressed, her voice taking on an edge. It was a gift for making the honor roll, Malcolm answered simply, not looking up from his screen. Karen made a sound that might have been a laugh, but contained no humor. Your parents must be very generous. A voice from across the aisle interrupted their exchange. Excuse me, but are you implying something about this young man? Malcolm glanced up to see an older black woman with silver-streaked hair and elegant glasses observing them sharply. Her name was Dr. Loretta Johnson. Malcolm didn't know that yet. Karen flushed slightly. I was just making conversation. Dr. Johnson replied, clearly unconvinced. She turned to Malcolm with a warm smile. That's an excellent book on aerospace engineering. Are you interested in the field? Malcolm nodded, grateful for the friendly face. I'm hoping to study it in college. Wonderful. My late husband was an engineer for NASA. It's a fascinating career. The conversation was interrupted when Karen pressed the call button again. This time, a different flight attendant responded. Could I get another glass of champagne? Karen asked, then added in a lower voice. And could you keep an eye on my belongings? I need to use the restroom, but I'm concerned about security. The flight attendant's expression remained professional, but their eyes flicked briefly to Malcolm before returning to Karen. Your belongings will be perfectly safe, ma'am. As Karen stood to leave, she made a show of placing her purse in the overhead compartment rather than leaving it in her seat beside Malcolm. The gesture was obvious to everyone nearby. Dr. Johnson shook her head slightly, catching Malcolm's eye with a look of understanding and sympathy. Young man, she said once Karen was out of earshot. Don't let people like that dim your light. I've been dealing with them for 70 years, and the best response is excellence. Malcolm nodded appreciatively. Thank you. My parents tell me the same thing. Smart parents, Dr. Johnson replied with a nod. Malcolm Washington. Well, Malcolm Washington, I'm Dr. Loretta Johnson, retired physics professor. If you ever want to talk aerospace, Engineering, I'd be happy to share what I learned from my husband over 40 years of marriage to a rocket scientist. Their conversation continued pleasantly until Karen returned looking displeased to find Malcolm engaged in an animated discussion about propulsion systems with Dr. Johnson. Karen reclaimed her seat with another dramatic sigh and immediately pressed the call button again. Samantha appeared, her professional smile beginning to strain. Yes, ma'am. This young man's bag is taking up too much of my foot space, Karen complained, pointing to Malcolm's backpack, which was neatly tucked under the seat in front of him, entirely on his side. Samantha glanced down and then back at Karen. I don't see how it's affecting your space, ma'am. But she turned to Malcolm. Sir, would you mind adjusting your bag? Of course, Malcolm replied, pushing his backpack even further under the seat, though it had already been properly stowed. Thank you, Samantha said, then addressed Karen. Is there anything else I can help with? Actually, yes, Karen said, lowering her voice, but still loud enough for Malcolm to hear. I'm not comfortable with my current seating arrangement. I think you know why. The implication hung heavily in the air. Samantha's professional demeanor cracked slightly as her eyes widened, but she quickly composed herself. Ma'am, if you have specific concerns, I'd be happy to discuss them privately. I think it's obvious, Karen insisted. I paid full price for this ticket and I expect a certain level of comfort and security. Malcolm kept his eyes fixed on his tablet, his ears burning with embarrassment and anger. He'd experienced racism before, but rarely so blatantly, and never when he was alone without his parents to shield him. Dr. Johnson cleared her throat loudly from across the aisle. Young lady, she called to Samantha, I believe this woman is implying something inappropriate about this young man based solely on his race. As a paying customer myself, I find that to be what's creating an uncomfortable environment. Several other passengers looked up, the tension in the cabin palpable. Karen's face flushed, but rather than backing down, she doubled down. I have concerns about my personal belongings, she insisted, and I have every right to express them. As the situation escalated, Malcolm wished he could disappear. Quick text to his father. Having some trouble on the flight. A woman doesn't think I belong in first class. Getting uncomfortable. The response came quickly. Stay calm, son. Don't let her provoke you. Already at the airport handling some business. Which flight are you on again? Malcolm texted his flight number, then put his phone away as he noticed Karen watching him suspiciously, as if his texting confirmed her assumptions about him. What Malcolm didn't know was that his father was already making calls that would change the course of this flight dramatically. Benjamin Washington had not become one of the most successful businessmen in the country by allowing people to disrespect his family. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing that they were experiencing a weather delay and would remain on the tarmac for approximately 30 more minutes. A collective groan rippled through the cabin. Malcolm closed his eyes briefly, realizing he was now trapped in this uncomfortable situation for even longer. Had been silently seething since Dr. Johnson's intervention, saw this as an opportunity to escalate matters. She pressed the call button again, her fourth time since boarding. James appeared this time, his patient smile. Mr. Washington, I'm very sorry, but the police would like to speak with you at the gate. It's just a formality to complete their report. Malcolm's stomach dropped. Despite having done nothing wrong, he knew that interactions with police carry different risks for him than they might for others. His parents had drilled this into him from an early age. Do I have to go? He asked. Quietly. James lowered his voice. The officers assured me. It's just to get your statement. They're well aware of the situation, but legally, they need to hear from both parties. Malcolm nodded resignedly and gathered his belongings. As he stood to leave, Dr. Johnson spoke up from across the aisle. Young man, would you like me to accompany you? I witnessed everything. The offer touched Malcolm deeply. Thank you, ma'am, but I'll be okay. My mom's an attorney, and she's already talking to them. Dr. Johnson nodded, but handed him a business card. Loretta Johnson, Ph.D. My number's on there. Call if you need another witness statement. Malcolm thanked her and made his way to the front of the aircraft. As he stepped into the jet bridge, he found a small crowd had gathered. The 2 airport police officers, the gate agent, the airline manager, and Karen, who was gesticulating wildly as she continued her tirade. There he is, Karen exclaimed when she spotted Malcolm. Check his backpack. The first officer, whose name tag read Officer Diaz, turned to Malcolm with a professional but not unkind expression. Mr. Washington, we just need to ask you a few questions to complete our report. Malcolm nodded, keeping his hands visible as his parents had taught him. Sir, can you tell us in your own words what happened on the aircraft? Malcolm recounted the events calmly, from Karen's initial reaction to his presence in first class to her escalating comments and ultimately her search of his backpack and accusation of theft. That's ridiculous. Karen interrupted. He's making this about race when it's about suspicious behavior. Ma'am, please let him finish. The second officer, Officer Reynolds, said firmly. Malcolm continued his account, explaining about the tablet being a gift from his parents for his academic achievements. I have the receipt in my email, and my fingerprint unlocks it, he concluded. Officer Diaz nodded. Can you show us that, please? Malcolm opened his email on his phone, found the receipt his mother had forwarded to him. When they gave him the tablet, and then demonstrated the fingerprint unlock feature on the tablet itself. That proves nothing, Karen insisted. He could have stolen the password too. Officer Reynolds raised an eyebrow. Ma'am, fingerprints aren't passwords. They're biometric identifiers. Karen flushed but doubled down. But could have others stolen items. Has anyone thoroughly searched his bag? Sullivan. Officer Diaz said firmly, you've provided no evidence or reasonable suspicion to justify searching this young man's belongings. In fact, you've admitted to searching his property without consent, which is potentially a criminal offense. I was concerned for my safety, Karen repeated, her voice rising. Can you articulate exactly what Mr. Washington did that made you fear for your safety? Officer Reynolds asked. Karen floundered. He was constantly checking his phone, and he has expensive items that someone his age shouldn't have, so no actual threatening behavior. Reynolds clarified. You're not listening to me. Karen was becoming increasingly agitated. I know what suspicious looks like. The conversation continued. Malcolm noticed more people gathering at the end of the jet bridge. Among them was a familiar figure that made his heart leap with relief. His mother, Jasmine Washington, striding purposefully toward them in her impeccable attorney attire, her expression a controlled storm. Malcolm, she called out, quickening her. Mom. Malcolm had never been so glad to see her. Jasmine reached him and pulled him into a brief, fierce hug before turning to face the officers, instantly shifting into professional mode. Jasmine Washington, attorney at Blackwell and Associates. I'm Malcolm's mother. What's the situation here, officers? Officer Diaz explained the circumstances briefly. Jasmine listened intently, her expression unreadable, except for the slight tightening around her eyes when he mentioned Karen's accusations. I see, Jasmine said when he finished. And has my son been charged with anything? No. Officer Reynolds assured her. We're simply gathering statements about the incident. Then I must insist that this questioning end immediately, Jasmine stated firmly. Son is a minor, and any questioning without a parent present is inappropriate at best and potentially illegal at worst. Karen, who had been watching the exchange with growing agitation, suddenly pointed at Jasmine. See, she's trying to obstruct justice. They're clearly hiding something. Jasmine turned to Karen, her gaze coolly assessing. Miss Sullivan, is it? I understand you searched my son's belongings without permission and accused him of theft based solely on your assumption that he couldn't legitimately own an iPad. It was suspicious, Karen insisted. The seat in front of him. He pulled out his book on aerospace engineering, a field he hoped to study in college like his father before him. Benjamin Washington had always nurtured his son's interest in how things fly, and Malcolm devoured any material he could find on the subject. The first-class cabin was still relatively empty when Karen Sullivan boarded. A white woman in her early 50s with an expensive blonde bob and designer clothes, she carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to wealth and privilege. Her lips thinned to a tight line when she spotted Malcolm sitting in the seat next to hers. "Excuse me," Karen said, addressing not Malcolm, but the flight attendant who was welcoming passengers. "I think there's been some mistake. I specifically booked a first-class seat." The flight attendant, whose name tag read Samantha, looked confused. "Ma'am, this is first class." Karen gestured subtly toward Malcolm, pretended to be absorbed in his book, though his ears burned with awareness. "But I don't think I mean is everyone in their correct seats?" Understanding dawned in Samantha's eyes, followed quickly by discomfort. "Let me check your boarding pass, ma'am," she said professionally, extending her hand. Karen presented her ticket with manicured fingers. Samantha verified it and handed it back with a polite smile. "Yes, you're in 3B right here, next to this young man." Karen's mouth tightened. Further, she looked at Malcolm as if expecting him to realize his error and move, but he simply looked up and offered a polite nod before returning to his book. "Could you check his ticket too?" Karen asked, her voice lowered, but still audible to Malcolm. Samantha hesitated, then turned to Malcolm. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" "Sure," Malcolm said, pulling it from his hoodie pocket and handing it over without complaint. He was used to being questioned. Samantha glanced at it and nodded. "Everything is in order. Mr. Washington is assigned to seat 3A. Karen sighed dramatically as she stored her designer handbag in the overhead compartment and took her seat, making a show of keeping as much distance from Malcolm as the first-class seat would allow. Malcolm caught a whiff of expensive perfume as she settled in. "These tickets cost thousands of dollars," Karen muttered, just loud enough for both Malcolm and Samantha to hear. "Don't understand how just anyone can be here these days." Malcolm tensed but said nothing, remembering his parents' advice. "Don't give them a reason. Keep your dignity." Instead, he turned a page in his book even though he'd stopped absorbing the words. "Can I get you a pre-flight beverage?" Samantha asked them, both clearly trying to ease the tension. "Just water for me, please," Malcolm replied. "I'll have champagne," Karen said. "Dom Perignon." "You have it." As Samantha moved away, Karen turned slightly toward Malcolm. "Aren't you a little young to be traveling alone in first class?" The question seemed innocent enough, but her tone made it clear what she was really asking. "How could someone like you afford to be here?" "My mom upgraded me with her points," Malcolm explained briefly, not feeling obligated to share more. "How nice," Karen replied with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I suppose anyone can collect points these days. My husband and I prefer to pay full price. It ensures a certain quality of experience." More passengers filed into the first-class cabin, most giving Malcolm the same subtle double-take that Karen had, though none were as openly disapproving. Malcolm buried himself deeper in his book, wishing his father's words about ignoring others' prejudice were easier to follow in practice. Karen pulled out her phone and began scrolling through social media, occasionally making small noises of disapproval at whatever she was reading. When Samantha returned with their drinks, Karen made a point of asking loudly about the meal service, emphasizing her gluten allergy and distaste for anything too ethnic. Malcolm sipped his water quietly, thinking about the week ahead in Atlanta. He missed his friends from the neighborhood, the ones he'd left behind when he received the scholarship to Westlake. Though his parents had assured him it was an opportunity he couldn't pass up, sometimes he felt caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. As the final boarding announcements were made, Malcolm received a text from his father. "The flight's good, son. Got a surprise waiting for you when you land. Love you." The message brought a smile to his face. His father's surprises were always thoughtful. Last time it had been tickets to an aviation museum. Malcolm texted back a quick thank you before switching his phone to airplane mode. Karen noticed his latest model smartphone and raised her eyebrows. That's quite the fancy phone for a student, she remarked her. Implication clear. It was a gift for my dad, Malcolm replied simply, slipping it into his pocket. Karen hummed skeptically. Well, I hope you have a receipt for it. So many of these phones get stolen these days. Malcolm felt his jaw tighten but kept his expression neutral. He'd been dealing with these kinds of comments his entire life, and at 15 he was already wearily familiar with the assumptions people made about him based solely on the color of his skin. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration, and Malcolm forced himself to focus on that instead of the woman beside him, who had already decided who he was without knowing a single thing about him. As the remaining passengers filed onto the plane, the first-class cabin filled with the typical business travelers and wealthy vacationers. Malcolm noticed several of them glance curiously in his direction, some with the same subtle look of surprise that Karen had displayed upon seeing him in first class. He'd grown accustomed to being the only black student in many of his classes at Westlake Prep, but the feeling of being an outsider never quite faded. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat as the captain announced a slight delay due to air traffic. Sighed loudly and pressed the flight attendant call button. Samantha appeared promptly. How can I help you, ma'am? I was wondering if there are any other available seats in first class, Karen asked, not bothering to lower her voice. I really need more space for my condition. Samantha glanced around the now full first-class cabin. I'm sorry, but we're completely booked today. Is there something specific I can help with to make you more comfortable? It's my hip, Karen explained, though she showed no signs of discomfort when she had boarded. I really need to be able to stretch out a bit more. Malcolm pretended to be absorbed in his book, but his grip on the pages tightened. It was clear what Karen was really asking. I understand, but all our first-class seats have the same dimensions, Samantha explained patiently. Would an extra pillow help? Karen huffed. I suppose it will have to do. As Samantha left to retrieve a pillow, Karen turned slightly toward Malcolm, eyeing his aerospace engineering book with obvious skepticism. Isn't that it? The contrast with the commercial flight couldn't have been more stark. Plush leather seats, polished wood accents, and attentive staff created an atmosphere of exclusivity that made Malcolm acutely aware of the duality of his existence. A young black man who could be racially profiled one moment and treated like royalty the next, all depending on whether people knew who his father was. Once they were settled and the jet was preparing for takeoff, Benjamin finally addressed the elephant in the room. I owe you both an explanation, he began, his normally confident voice tinged with uncertainty. Malcolm, you know, I've always tried to keep my position with the airline separate from our family life. I've wanted you to develop your own identity, to earn your own achievements without the shadow of privilege. Malcolm nodded. His father had always been adamant about this, refusing to use his influence to give Malcolm advantages that other children didn't have. But today, Benjamin continued, when I got your text about what was happening, something shifted for me. I realized I've been operating under a flawed assumption that by not using my privilege to protect you, I was somehow helping you build character or teaching you self-reliance. He paused, looking out the window at the airport they were about to leave behind. The truth is that woman didn't care about your character or your achievements. She saw your skin and made a judgment. And in that moment, all my principles about earning your own way seemed hollow compared to my responsibility to keep you safe. Jasmine reached across to take Benjamin's hand. We've both been wrestling with this balance, Ben. How to prepare Malcolm for the realities of being a black man in America while also giving him room to just be a teenager. Malcolm looked between his parents, seeing them not as the confident, accomplished adults who had always seemed to have all the answers, but as people grappling with the same questions that plagued him. I understand why you came, he said to his father. Glad you did. But he hesitated, trying to articulate the discomfort he felt. It feels weird that everything changed once they realized who you were. Only deserved respect because my dad is important. Benjamin nodded solemnly. That's exactly what bothers me too, son. The system shouldn't work that way. One should need powerful parents to be treated with basic dignity. But the reality is it does work that way. Sometimes. And today, I chose to use that broken system to protect you, even though it reinforces the very inequality I've spent my career fighting against. The jet began to taxi down the runway, the gentle acceleration pushing them back into their seats. The symbolism wasn't lost on any of them, moving forward while forces pushed against them. So, what do we do with this? Malcolm asked the question, encompassing far more than just today's incident. Jasmine, ever the strategist, was already thinking several moves ahead. We use what happened as leverage for systemic change, she said firmly. Not just Antibious training for airline staff, but comprehensive policy reviews, better accountability mechanisms, maybe even an independent civil rights audit of the entire company. And we go public. With it, Benjamin added, his business mind engaging. Not to shame the airline, that would be self-defeating given my position, but to create transparency around the process of addressing these issues, to show other companies that acknowledging problems and working to fix them is better than the usual corporate strategy of denial and defensiveness. Malcolm considered his parents' perspectives, but found himself thinking about the personal dimension as well. What about Karen? He asked. Do you think anything will really change for her, or will she just be more careful about saying the quiet part out loud next? It was a perceptive question that cut to the heart of the matter. Policies and training could create better systems, but changing hearts and minds was a different challenge. Entirely. That's where the real work lies, Jasmine acknowledged. And it's work that can't be mandated or legislated. It happens person by person, conversation by conversation. The three of them fell silent for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. As the jet lifted off the ground, rising above the airport where Malcolm's humiliation had played out just an hour earlier. I've been thinking about something, Benjamin said finally. Mother, and I have always taught you to handle these situations with dignity and restraint, to be the bigger person. Watching you today, I was incredibly proud of how you conducted yourself. Malcolm nodded, acknowledging the familiar refrain. Stay calm. Don't give them ammunition. Prove them wrong through excellence. But I'm starting to wonder, Benjamin continued, his voice thoughtful. If we've put too much of the burden on you, on all black children, we tell you to be perfect, to never show anger or frustration, to always take the high road. Meanwhile, people like Karen Sullivan get to act on their worst impulses without consequence. Jasmine squeezed her husband's hand, recognizing the rare vulnerability in his admission. I've been thinking the same thing, she confessed. As a civil rights attorney, I fight these battles in court every day. But today, watching our son go through this, it hit differently. Malcolm looked between his parents, surprised by this shift in perspective. So, what are you saying? That I should have gotten angry, yelled back at her? Benjamin shook his head. I'm saying that your mother and I and society as a whole need to stop expecting black people to be the ones who always have to take the high road. The work of dismantling racism shouldn't fall primarily on those who constitutes harassment based on racial prejudice, which I'm certain violates your airline's policies. James nodded, looking relieved that someone had named the obvious issue. Yes, it does, ma'am. We have a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior on our flights. Karen gasped, affronted. How dare you accuse me of racism? I simply expressed concern about a suspicious individual. This has nothing to do with race, doesn't it? Dr. Johnson challenged, adjusting her glasses. Because I've been watching you since you boarded, and you haven't expressed concern about any of the other passengers in first class. Just the only black child. Other passengers began to murmur, some nodding in agreement with Dr. Johnson, others looking uncomfortable at the confrontation. Karen, realizing she was losing support, changed tactics. He has expensive electronics that seem unusual for someone his age. That's all I'm saying. Malcolm, finding his voice, responded quietly. My father is an engineer. My mother is an attorney. They work hard to provide for me, and they reward my hard work at school. There's nothing suspicious about that. A white businessman across the aisle spoke up. The kid's been reading an engineering textbook and doing homework since we boarded. Leave him alone for God's sake. Karen, now feeling cornered, pressed the call button yet again. When Samantha appeared, looking increasingly concerned about the situation, Karen demanded, I want to be moved to a different seat immediately. I'm afraid we're fully booked in first class, Samantha explained. But if you're uncomfortable, we can see if there's availability in economy. The suggestion that she should move to economy rather than Malcolm was clearly not what Karen had expected. Her face flushed with anger. This is unacceptable. I paid thousands for this seat, as did the parents of this young man, James pointed out. Or they earned it through loyalty to our airline. The way has the same right to be here as you do. Karen fumbled in her purse and pulled out her phone. I'm going to record this. Everyone will see how I'm being treated. She attempted to point her phone at Malcolm. James stepped between them. Me, do not have permission to record a minor without parental consent. That's both against airline policy and potentially illegal. What James didn't notice was that Karen had already snapped several photos of Malcolm without his knowledge. While he was focused on his tablet, Malcolm felt a mix of emotions washing over him. Embarrassment, anger, and a deep sense of injustice. He'd experienced racial profiling before. The security guards who followed him in stores. The teachers who expressed surprise at his academic excellence. The parents of friends who seemed uncomfortable when he visited their homes. But never so publicly and never so aggressively. He thought about texting his mother, but didn't want to worry her when she was in the middle of an important case. His father hadn't responded to his last message, which was unusual. Benjamin Washington was typically quick to reply to his son, especially in times of distress. What Malcolm didn't know was that his father was already taking action, having recognized the flight number Malcolm had sent him. Karen, seemingly oblivious to the discomfort she was causing, continued her campaign. I want to speak to the captain right now, she insisted. I don't feel safe and no one is taking my concerns seriously. James, maintaining his professionalism despite the difficult situation, replied firmly, the captain is preparing for takeoff, ma'am. But I assure you, there were any legitimate safety concerns, we would address them immediately. This is discrimination against me as a concerned passenger, Karen declared loudly. A voice from several rows back called out, the only discrimination happening here is against that young man. The cabin was now clearly divided, with most passengers expressing support for Malcolm through nods, sympathetic glances, or outright verbal defense. However, Malcolm noticed with a sinking feeling that a few passengers, particularly an older white couple seated behind Karen, seemed to be watching him with newfound suspicion. This was the insidious nature of racism that his parents had warned him about. How one person's unfounded accusations could plant seeds of doubt in others' minds. How the burden of proof always seemed to fall on him rather than his accuser. Karen, sensing she had gained at least some allies, pressed on. Not moving to economy. I paid for first class and I demand to be treated with respect. Respect is a two-way street, ma'am, James replied, his patience clearly wearing thin. And right now you're not showing respect to your fellow passenger, because he's not a real first-class passenger. Karen blurted out, then immediately seemed to realize her mistake as gasps echoed through the cabin. Malcolm closed his eyes briefly, feeling the familiar weight of being judged not by his character or actions, but by preconceived notions about who belonged where. When he opened them again, he was surprised to find several passengers had pulled out their phones and were recording the incident despite James's earlier warning about filming minors. Think Dr. Johnson said loudly that everyone on this flight now understands exactly what kind of concern you're expressing with them. As the confrontation reached its peak, The captain's voice came over the intercom again. "This is your captain speaking. We've been informed of a situation in the cabin that requires attention. We'll be returning to the gate to resolve this matter before takeoff." Malcolm's heart sank. The delay would mean he might miss his connection and his aunt would be left waiting at the airport in Atlanta. All because one woman couldn't accept that a black teenager belonged in first class. Addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the inconvenience. We'll be returning to the gate briefly to address a passenger situation." Karen smiled triumphantly, clearly believing the captain's decision validated her concerns. She leaned toward Malcolm and whispered, "See, they're taking it seriously now." What she didn't realize was that the airline had strict protocols for handling incidents of discrimination, and the captain's decision to return to the gate was not for the reason she assumed. As the plane began its taxi back to the terminal, Malcolm quietly texted his father an update. "They're taking us back to the gate because of this woman's complaints about me." "I'm sorry, Dad." Benjamin Washington's response was immediate this time. "Don't apologize, son. You've done nothing wrong. I'm handling it." Malcolm wondered what his father meant by handling it, but he had no time to ponder as the plane docked at the gate and the cabin door was opened. 2 airport police officers boarded, followed by a man in an airline management uniform. The confrontation was about to reach its climax, and Malcolm had no idea that his father's influence was already reshaping the situation in ways neither he nor Karen could have anticipated. As the plane returned to the gate situation, the lounge door opened again and a woman in an executive uniform entered, introducing herself as Patricia Chin, the airline's chief operating officer. She had clearly been briefed on the situation, judging by her solemn expression. "Mr. and Mrs. Washington, on behalf of Atlantic Airways, I want to express our deepest apologies for the inexcusable treatment your son experienced today," she began. "We have a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior, and we clearly failed to uphold that standard." Chen turned to Malcolm directly. "Young man, no passenger on our airline should ever be made to feel unwelcome or unsafe because of their race. What happened to you today represents a serious failure on our part, and we are committed to making it right." Turning back to Benjamin and Jasmine, she continued, "We're preparing our corporate jet to take your family to Atlanta immediately. Ms. Sullivan has been removed from today's flight and will be banned from flying with Atlantic Airways pending a full investigation. We'll also be implementing additional amphibious training for all customer-facing staff effective immediately." Karen's face drained of color. But I have a return flight next week. Have business commitments. Perhaps you should have considered those commitments before harassing a minor," Jasmine remarked coldly. Officer Diaz addressed the Washingtons. "We'll need to know if you wish to press charges regarding the unauthorized search of your son's belongings." Benjamin and Jasmine exchanged glances, having a silent conversation born from years of partnership. Then they looked to Malcolm. "It's your decision, son," Benjamin said quietly. "Whatever you choose, we'll support you." Malcolm considered for a long moment, looking at Karen's fearful expression. Despite everything she had put him through, he found no satisfaction in her distress. What would pursuing charges really accomplish? It wouldn't change her heart or mind. It wouldn't erase what had happened. And it would mean prolonging an ordeal he just wanted to put behind him. "I don't want to press charges," he decided finally. "But I do want her to understand what she did was wrong. Really wrong. Not just inconvenient for her." Jasmine nodded, respecting her son's choice, while making a mental note to discuss other avenues for accountability later. The criminal justice system wasn't the only path to resolution, especially for someone with her legal expertise. In that case, Patricia Chin interjected, "Perhaps Miss Sullivan would agree to attend our company's comprehensive amphibious training program as a condition of any future consideration for reinstatement of her flying privileges." Karen looked like she wanted to object, but seemed to realize she had few cards left to play. "Fine," she muttered. "And a formal written apology to my son," Jasmine added firmly. "One that acknowledges the true nature of your actions today, not a deflection about misunderstandings or safety concerns. Karen's jaw tightened, but she nodded stiffly. Officer Diaz seemed satisfied. With this resolution, we'll still need to file a report about the incident, but without charges being pressed, this becomes primarily a civil matter between the parties involved. As the officers prepared to escort Karen away, she paused and turned back, her expression a complex mix of embarrassment, defensiveness, and dawning realization. I really didn't think of myself as that kind of person, she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else in the room. Few people do. Miss Sullivan, Benjamin replied, his tone softer but no less firm. That's what racism persists because good people refuse to recognize it in themselves. With that, Karen was led away, leaving the Washingtons alone with the airline executives. The tension in the room shifted from the immediate crisis to the broader implications. Patricia Chin addressed Benjamin directly. Mr. Washington, as a board member and major shareholder, you've consistently advocated for diversity and inclusion initiatives within the company. Clear we still have significant work to do. I welcome any additional guidance you might offer in light of today's events. Benjamin nodded thoughtfully. This isn't just about training, Patricia. It's about culture. When that woman first began harassing my son, how many passengers spoke up? How many of your staff intervened decisively? The problem isn't just the Karens of the world. It's the systems that enable them. As the executives absorbed this critique, Jasmine turned her attention to Malcolm, who had gone quiet again. Behind his composed exterior, she could see the emotional toll of the day weighing on him. What should have been a simple trip home for spring break had become yet another lesson in navigating a world that too often judged him by his skin rather than his character. Ready to go home, sweetie? She asked gently, momentarily setting aside her at return persona to simply be his mother. Malcolm nodded, looking suddenly younger than his 15 years. Yeah. I just want to see my friends and forget about all this for a while. As they prepared to leave for the corporate jet, Jasmine found herself reflecting on the painful paradox of their situation. Their family's privilege, Benjamin's wealth and position, her legal expertise had protected Malcolm today in ways unavailable to countless other young black men and women. Yet all of their success and influence couldn't shield him completely from the reality of racism. They could fight the battle one incident at a time, but the war continued relentlessly. What happened next would determine whether this became merely another painful memory or a catalyst for meaningful change both for the airline and for the Washingtons themselves. Jasmine made a silent promise to ensure it would be the latter. Her son deserved nothing less. The corporate jet gleamed on the tarmac, a sleek embodiment of privilege that Benjamin Washington rarely exercised for personal use. As the family was escorted across the runway by airline staff, Malcolm remained uncharacteristically quiet, processing the whirlwind of events that had transformed what should have been a routine flight into a public spectacle. Inside the luxury aircraft, racial bias in transportation and public accommodations. The airline industry, spurred by Atlantic Airways' example, would implement more comprehensive amphibious training and accountability mechanisms. And Karen Sullivan, true to her word, would document her journey of confronting her own prejudices, creating educational materials that would help countless others recognize and address their biases before they manifested in harmful actions. The road ahead wouldn't be easy for any of them. There would be setbacks and criticisms, moments of doubt and frustration. But as the Washington family drove home from the meeting, there was a sense that something significant had shifted. Not just in their lives, but in the broader conversation about race and accountability in America. Sometimes Malcolm reflected the most powerful response to injustice wasn't retribution, but transformation. And while he hadn't asked for the role thrust upon him by Karen's actions and the viral aftermath, he was beginning to see how he might use it to create meaningful change. Not just for himself, but for all the young black men and women who would come after him, hoping for a world where they could simply exist in any space without having to justify their presence. 1 month after the incident that had thrust Malcolm Washington into an unexpected spotlight, he stood before a gathered audience in the main conference room at Atlantic Airways headquarters. At 15, he was easily the youngest person in a room filled with airline executives, diversity consultants, civil rights advocates, and media representatives. Yet, as he approached the podium, Malcolm carried himself with a poise that belied his years. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady, despite the butterflies in his stomach. "My name is Malcolm Washington, and a month ago, I was just a student looking forward to spring break. Then I boarded a flight in first class, and a fellow passenger decided I didn't belong there." A hush fell over the room as Malcolm recounted the events of that day. The initial discomfort, the escalating accusations, the humiliation of being questioned by police. He spoke without bitterness, but with unflinching honesty about how it felt to be judged not by his character, but by the color of his skin. "What happened to me that day wasn't unique," Malcolm continued. "It happens to black people across America every day. The only unusual thing about my situation was that my father happened to be in a position to ensure there were consequences." He gestured toward Benjamin, who sat in the front row beside Jasmine, both watching their son with evident pride. But most people who experience racial profiling don't have that advantage. Their stories don't go viral. There are no corporate apologies or policy changes. They're just expected to absorb the hurt and keep moving forward. Malcolm paused, looking around the room at the attentive faces. "That's why what we're doing here today matters, because it's not just about one incident on one flight. It's about changing the systems that make such incidents possible." The occasion was the formal announcement of Atlantic Airways' comprehensive amphibious initiative developed in partnership with the newly established Washington Foundation. The airline was implementing mandatory training for all staff, revising its procedures for handling passenger conflicts, creating clear reporting mechanisms for incidents of discrimination, and establishing a diverse community advisory board to provide ongoing guidance. As Malcolm concluded his remarks and returned to his seat, Benjamin took the podium to outline the broader work of the foundation, which had already secured commitments from 3 other major airlines to implement similar reforms. "Today marks the beginning of a journey, not the end," Benjamin told the assembled group. "Real change doesn't happen overnight or through a single policy announcement. It happens through consistent effort, honest reflection, and a willingness to be uncomfortable in the pursuit of justice." Following Benjamin's presentation, Patricia Chin detailed the specific steps Atlantic Airways was taking, emphasizing accountability and measurable outcomes rather than vague promises. "We are committed to creating an environment where every passenger is treated with dignity and respect regardless of race, gender, religion, or any other characteristic," she assured the audience. "And we recognize that commitment must be backed by concrete actions and transparent reporting." As the formal presentations concluded and a gathering transitioned to a networking reception, Malcolm found himself approached by journalists eager for additional comments. With Jasmine close by to ensure boundaries were respected, he answered questions thoughtfully, neither minimizing the harm he had experienced nor allowing himself to be portrayed as a helpless victim. "I'm fortunate to have parents who prepared me for these kinds of situations," he told one reporter who asked how he had remained so composed during the incident. "But no child should have to be prepared for racial profiling. That's the real issue here." Across the room, Karen Sullivan stood, engaged in conversation with a civil rights attorney. True to her commitment, she had spent the past month immersed in amphibious training, community service, and difficult self-reflection. Today marked her first public appearance as part of the Foundation's educational initiative. Earlier, she had delivered a powerful statement about her journey from denial to recognition of her own biases. "I never thought of myself as racist," she had admitted to the audience. "But that day on the plane, my actions revealed prejudices I had refused to acknowledge. Confronting that truth has been painful but necessary." As part of her work with the Foundation, Karen was documenting her experiences in a series of educational videos aimed at helping others recognize and address their own biases. The initial installments had been met with mixed reactions online, some praising her accountability while others remained skeptical of her motives, but the conversations they sparked were precisely what the foundation hoped to encourage. Malcolm observed Karen from across the room, still processing his complicated feelings about her involvement. Part of him appreciated her willingness to publicly own her mistakes and work toward change. Another part remained wary, understanding that real transformation required more than a month of good intentions. His contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Loretta Johnson, the retired physics professor who had defended him on the plane. The Washingtons had invited her to the event as a special guest. "There's my brave young engineer." She greeted him warmly. "How are you holding up with all this attention?" Malcolm smiled genuinely for the first time that day. "It's intense, Dr. Johnson, but I'm trying to focus on the positive changes coming from it. Operates and how it can be recognized and addressed. It would have to come with real accountability," Jasmine cautioned. "Not just a quick apology tour and then back to business as usual." Of course, Malcolm agreed. Maybe she could do community service with organizations in Black communities, get to know people as individuals instead of stereotypes, and document the process as part of the Foundation's educational materials. As they discussed the possibilities, Benjamin's expression grew increasingly thoughtful. "You know, this approach aligns perfectly with the Foundation's mission. Not just identifying problems, but working towards solutions. And it would certainly generate attention for the cause. It's not without risks," Jasmine pointed out her legal mind identifying potential pitfalls. If Karen isn't sincere, or if she reverts to problematic behavior later, it could undermine the Foundation's credibility. "True," Malcolm acknowledged. "But isn't that risk worth taking if there's a chance for real change? Not just for Karen, but for all the people who might see themselves in her and recognize their own biases." His parents looked at him with a mixture of pride and wonder. In the midst of a situation where he had every right to feel anger and resentment, their son was thinking about broader solutions and long-term impact. "I think it's worth exploring," Benjamin decided. "I'll reach out to Patricia and see if she can arrange a conversation with Karen." The next several days were a whirlwind of activity. Benjamin worked with the airline's PR team to craft a comprehensive response to the incident, one that went beyond the usual corporate platitudes to outline specific, measurable actions the company would take to address racial bias. Jasmine consulted with her colleagues about the legal framework for the Foundation and the conditions under which Karen might participate in its work. And Malcolm, despite it being his spring break, found himself drawn into these discussions, offering insights from his perspective as both the target of the incident and a young person with a fresh view on restorative justice. 5 days after the incident, the Washingtons agreed to a meeting with Karen Sullivan at a neutral location, a conference room at Jasmine's law firm. The atmosphere was tense as Karen entered, looking significantly less polished than she had on the plane. The viral infamy had clearly taken its toll. There were dark circles under her eyes, and she seemed to have aged years. In less than a week. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," she began, her voice subdued. "I know I don't deserve your time after how I behaved," Benjamin nodded, his expression neutral. "Before we begin, I want to be clear about something. We're here because our son suggested this meeting. Because he believes in the possibility of growth and learning even from painful experiences. That says everything about his character and nothing about any obligation on our part to provide you with absolution." Karen nodded, swallowing hard. "I understand." "Good," Jasmine said. "Then let's talk about what happens next." What followed was a difficult but productive conversation. Karen spoke about the shame of seeing her behavior captured on video, of having to explain to her own children why people were calling their mother a racist online. She acknowledged that the public humiliation had forced her to confront aspects of herself she had previously refused to examine. "I've always considered myself a good person," she explained, tears welling in her eyes. I donate to charity. I volunteer. I teach my kids to be kind. But watching those videos, seeing how I treated Malcolm, I didn't recognize myself. Or maybe the truth is I finally did recognize a part of myself I've never wanted to acknowledge. Malcolm, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. What made you so sure I didn't belong in first class? What was it about me that triggered that reaction? The directness of the question seemed to catch Karen off guard. She struggled visibly before answering. I want to say it wasn't about race. Admitted finally. That's what I've been telling myself for days. That I would have been concerned about any teenager traveling alone in first class. But that's not true, is it? If you had been a white kid in a polo shirt instead of a black kid in a hoodie, I probably wouldn't have thought twice about it. The raw honesty of her admission hung in the air between them. That recognition is important, Benjamin said after a moment. But it's only the beginning. He then outlined the proposal they had discussed. As a family, instead of simply being subjected to public shaming, Karen would work with the Washington Foundation as it was now being called, to document her journey of confronting and addressing her own biases. She would complete a substantial amount of community service in predominantly black neighborhoods, participate in extensive Antibes training, and contribute to educational materials aimed at helping others recognize and address their own prejudices. This isn't about making you comfortable or rehabilitating your image, Jasmine clarified. It's about converting a harmful incident into something potentially constructive. Karen listened intently, occasionally wiping away tears. When they finished explaining the proposal, she nodded slowly. I want to do this, she said, not to save my reputation or get people to stop being angry at me, but because I need to be better than the person I was on that plane. And maybe by sharing this process, I can help other people avoid making the same mistakes. As the meeting concluded, Malcolm offered a final thought that underscored the wisdom beyond his years. What happened on that plane wasn't just about you and me, he told Karen. It was about systems and assumptions that have been in place for generations. Changing those systems is going to take more than one conversation or one viral video. It's going to take all of us doing the uncomfortable work of examining our beliefs and our behaviors. Even me. Karen looked at him with genuine surprise. Even you. But you were the victim in this situation. Malcolm shook his head. That doesn't make me perfect or immune to having biases of my own. We all have work to do. Some more than others, added with a pointed look. But all of us have room to grow. As they left the meeting, Benjamin placed a proud hand on his son's shoulder. You continue to amaze me, Malcolm. Your mother and I try to teach you, but increasingly I find myself learning from you. Malcolm smiled, though there was a hint of weariness in his eyes. I just want something good to come out of all this. What none of them could have predicted was just how much good would eventually emerge from that difficult day on the plane. The Washington Foundation would go on to become a leading voice in addressing